Whilst Hitler was ruminating on his impending victory, German army radio captured the intense fighting that continued in the heart of Stalingrad.
Dieses Stadtviertel, das sich längs des Wolgaufers erstreckt, ist das eigentliche Behörden- und Wohnviertel. Es besteht in der Hauptsache aus festen Steinhäusern, die meist noch aus der zaristischen Zeit stammen. Nur die wenigen modernen Bauten aus der bolschewistischen Epoche heben sich nicht immer zum Besten aus dem großen Ganzen heraus. Und dieser Stadtteil ist nun, wie gesagt, in ein einziges Ruinenfeld, in eine Trümmerstätte verwandelt, wie man sie sich trostloser und grauenhafter nicht vorstellen kann. Wir müssen heute schon von Stalingrad als einer toten und vernichteten Stadt sprechen. Das wiederum zeugt für die Härte des Kampfes. Denn hier in diesen festen Häusern war der Widerstand natürlich besonders zäh.
It was the bloodiest battle of the Second World War. A battle that came to define the rivalry between two of history's most brutal dictators. But how did the struggle for Stalingrad come to play such a defining role in the course of the Second World War? And how was Stalin able to pull off one of the greatest entrapments in military history? With the help of a team of experts, each taking the perspective of a figure involved, and using newsreels and rare radio recordings, we'll uncover the key moments and decisions that led to Stalin's ultimate victory over Hitler and the Nazis. After 4 months of heavy fighting, German commander Paulus and his troops still found themselves engaged in intense battles with Soviet forces for control of the city. 300,000 German soldiers had pinned down the last Soviet defenders to a narrow strip of land along the river Volga. Bloodied and exhausted, the remains of the Red Army stubbornly refused to give up the ground their comrades had bled and died for. Losing it would mean losing their last remaining foothold in the city. For Paulus, as long as Soviet resistance continued, he knew his army remained vulnerable and at risk of being trapped deep inside Russia. But for Hitler and the Nazi propaganda machine, the battle was won. He had secured another great victory against Stalin.
It's being proclaimed in the German press that they pretty much captured the city, and there's famous shots of the Sixth Army raising the flags in the centre of town to say that's exactly what they've done. But what they're not saying is the enemy, the Red Army, is still controlling small pockets of the city, only 100 meters, 150 meters in depth at various points, but they're still there in the city. They still have to be defeated, and despite all efforts, they still can't be shifted.
The Soviet troops were led by 2 men, Deputy Supreme Commander Zhukov and Field Commander Vasily Zhukov. Zhukov, who had been based in the heart of the city throughout the battle, now found himself pushed back to just 800 meters from the banks of the Volga. The 50,000 remaining Soviet troops were now confronted by a series of vicious German assaults. These attacks aimed to destroy the remaining Soviet positions and force them back across the Volga and out of the city. The most intense fighting took place in the tractor plant and barricade factory, huge industrial complexes that provided ample cover for the Soviet defenders, whilst leaving the approaching German troops dangerously exposed. Savage fighting raged back and forth, until finally German attackers wrested control of the factories from the Soviets. Despite suffering devastating losses, Zhukov was under strict orders by Zhukov to hold his position at all costs. What he didn't know was that his superiors were planning something that would change the battle and the war.
Zhukov knew that the Russian armed forces had an advantage here in Stalingrad. It didn't just know the town, it knew how to fight this style of war.
The moment that Zhukov is made Deputy Supreme Commander, he's already thinking big. He's thinking about big encirclements. And what comes together are two plans. So there is a massive counterattack being planned for around the Moscow front, which is Jupiter and Mars, and then there is a monster counterattack plan for the whole Don front and the Stalingrad front, which is Uranus and Saturn.
What Zhukov and Stalin were planning was a series of top-secret encirclements. Codenamed after the planets, the first was Operation Uranus, designed to encircle and trap Paulus and the Sixth Army in the ruins of Stalingrad by smashing through the Romanian and Italian Axis troops stationed on his flanks. It would be followed by Operation Saturn, a counter-offensive aiming to enlarge the area now controlled by the Soviet army. Operation Uranus was vast. It called upon over 1 million Soviet troops, 804 tanks, 13,400 artillery pieces, and over 1,000 aircraft. Planned in total secrecy, not even Zhukov, leading on the front line, knew what was coming. Soviet success relied on catching the Germans and their allies off guard. It would call upon all of Zhukov's experience as a military planner.
Zhukov is really skilled at coordinating huge quantities of absolutely everything you need for a war. So he is an absolute master of bringing together artillery and logistics. He would bring together air support, land support, and direct huge volumes of tanks.
Huge armies are just being born out of nothing.
Степью по берегам Волги шли к Сталинграду войска. Верховное главнокомандование формировало резервы для перехода в контрнаступление.
They're just emerging, fully formed, sort of uniformed, kitted out with rifles and guns and artillery and tanks. It's sort of like Sauron producing orc armies. I mean, it is quite extraordinary.
The planning of Uranus typifies Zhukov's hands-on, practical approach to leadership and the advantage it had over the detached, intellectual style of Paulus.
I think Zhukov knew that this battle was going to be decisive. It was going to be a major tipping point in how Russia engaged with Germany. The stakes were really high here. Zhukov has seen military experience at all levels. He went through the ranks, so he had a much broader experience than some of his generals, particularly the newer, less experienced ones. And this really informs the way that he participates in war. He's close to the front, he's close to his men, he's close to his actions, he's not hiding in political offices.
The thing you've got to remember about Paulus is he's leading the Sixth Army from way back behind the lines. Paulus was never on the front line until the bitter end when he surrendered.
In the early hours of the 19th of November, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. Beginning at 07:20 Moscow time, Soviet forces began with a huge assault on the Axis troops protecting Paulus's northern flank. Zhukov's troops broke through the Axis lines, completely wiping out 2 Romanian armies. The next day, further devastating attacks were launched on Paulus's southern flank.
20 ноября. Перешли в наступление войска Сталинградского фронта. Все шло строго по намеченному плану. Вперед! только вперед. Сколько советских бойцов осталось навечно в Волжской степи. Но живые продвигались вперед.
This huge counter-offensive was like nothing the Germans had ever seen before. It caught Paulus and his men totally off guard.
This is huge. I mean, in total, amassed around that area and around that front, Zhukov now has 1.1 million men. It's just a huge force, and 190,000 men earmarked specifically for Uranus.
So Zhukov again brings in his signature move of coordinating these huge volumes of men, artillery, logistics, and huge quantities of reserves at the back as well. And he's ready for this fight. The average German soldier would have just had no idea what was coming for them. They were not prepared for this.
Фронт прорыва становится все шире. В него устремляются массы нашей конницы.
Well, within 3 days, Soviet forces under Zhukov had achieved the impossible. They'd surrounded the Sixth Army and their allies.
330 тысяч фашистских солдат в кольце окружения.
It wasn't a kind of surrounding of just the city, it was the hinterland too. It ran for 50-odd kilometres to the north and south. It was a big area that Paulus's forces were now defending.
The encirclement was absolutely ruthless, and Zhukov didn't just trap this army, he absolutely annihilated it. And this was unheard of for Germany during this war.
Operation Uranus is launched, and Paulus, in the field, knows this is a huge threat to his army. He knows this could be absolutely cataclysmic. He contacts Hitler and he says, I need to punch out of this, I need to get out of this. Hitler's response is, you're not doing that. You are going to stay put, and I can send people to save you. Don't worry about that.
By the 22nd of November, the encirclement was complete.
Чтобы вызволить окруженную группировку, гитлеровцы бросили в наступление группу армий Дон. Но враг был остановлен и отброшен от Сталинградского котла.
All Paulus could do was stabilize his army's position and establish defensive lines to secure the area they now found themselves trapped in. An area that soon became known as the Stalingrad Kessel, or the Cauldron.
Zhukov and Stalin think that they're going to catch around perhaps 90,000 men on a good day. In actual fact, it's more like 250, 275,000. It's a lot more than they think. And it is entirely Hitler's fault.
The scale of what happened at Stalingrad is unimaginable to armies today. Soldiers were moved from different fronts, reserves were brought in. This is an overwhelming volume of soldiers.
Hitler faced a dangerous dilemma. Immediate defeat in Stalingrad would leave both Army Group Don and Army Group A cut off and at risk of destruction by the huge Soviet armies now advancing from the east. But retreat from the Caucasus would mean abandoning the oil fields that the German army so desperately needed.
Hitler has just no idea of sensible military tactics. If you're going to find yourself with any risk of being encircled, get out straight away. Hitler is too fascinated, obsessed with prestige and honour to withdraw. And he keeps saying, you generals, all you ever want to do is withdraw, withdraw, withdraw. That's not how you win the war. Ultimately, you win by conserving your men and your equipment. What you don't do is risk allowing 220,000 men to be encircled in the snow a very, very long way from home.
Paulus has seen the writing on the wall. He can see what's about to happen. There is an opportunity for them to pull back from Stalingrad, but that's not Hitler's way.
Hitler's instinct was he didn't want to lose Stalingrad. He'd already announced he'd captured Stalingrad, and he knew strategically it was an important place to be. He didn't want to retreat from there, but he knew the danger the army was in. And so he believed people like Göring, who were saying to him, my Luftwaffe can resupply any army that's trapped. And so that was almost Hitler's get-out clause. He wanted to believe the impossible could be done.
Hitler agreed with Göring's plan to supply Paulus and his army from the air. Göring had assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe was capable of flying in the required 750 tons of supplies a day. This was a lie. Both he and Hitler had been warned by their own staff that this was impossible. With few supplies reaching the trapped forces, starvation quickly set in amongst the men of the beleaguered Sixth Army.
One of the reasons why Hitler's completely unrealistic about what's going on is because Göring comes along and says, it's all right, the Luftwaffe can supply Paulus with an airlift, it's not a problem. But again, this is insane thinking. Why does Hitler listen to Göring? Göring is the man who has never really delivered on any of his promises. But he does listen to him, and he goes, great, well, there's an airlift, that'll be fine. What does that ignore? The fact is, the winter is not going to be very friendly to aircraft. Ailerons get iced up, you've got freezing fog, you've got everything that makes flying in 1942 difficult.
Most of Paulus's men would not die as a result of fighting, but from malnutrition and hypothermia. Wounded soldiers who were lucky enough to be flown out rarely reached home. Hitler's generals, fearing what the sight of the starving men would do to public morale, transported them to military hospitals outside of Germany.
Paulus has got his own commanders telling him, do we break out? At this early point of the encirclement, they recognise militarily that this is the best chance they've got. Try and break the encirclement before they're hermetically sealed in by stronger and increasingly stronger Soviet besiegers.
The more precarious Paulus's situation is, the more entrenched Hitler becomes that there can be no turning round. So suddenly you've got a situation where you've got Stalin going, there can be no retreats, and you've got Hitler going, there can be no retreats. So you've got this clash which is only going to end one way.
On the 27th of November, a message from Hitler was broadcast to German troops trapped in Stalingrad. The battle for Stalingrad is approaching its climax. The enemy has broken through into the rear of the German forces. In these difficult hours, my thoughts and those of the whole German nation are with you. You must, under all circumstances, under the command of your generals, hold Stalingrad, which you have conquered with so much blood. The message was clear. Paulus and his men were to stand fast.
He's been told to stay where he is, but that doesn't stop him making the plea or making the argument or the case to his supreme commander, can I break out? This is the plan we have, Operation Thunderclap it was called. Being Paulus, it's very detailed. This is how our forces are going to break out. I know we've got over 300,000 men. I know we've got all this material in terms of armoured forces, motorised forces, trucks, over 50,000 horses. We know we're going to lose the bulk of this, pushing through the Russian winter to get back to our lines and fighting our way out. But at this early juncture, we could probably still do.
Paulus's requests to break out were denied. The Sixth Army was to hold their position.
Now that the encirclement has happened, it's a reality, and Hitler also realises that the Luftwaffe just can't get through in the numbers required to keep Paulus supplied. The mood in HQ is absolutely at rock bottom. I mean, Hitler still tries to project this outward feeling of confidence, but actually he admits that he's not sleeping well. He knows this is going to be potentially a complete disaster. You know, you got nearly 250,000 men right there, trapped and starving. those around him, high command, they know this is a Paulus situation. And of course, Paulus is always kind of radioing in and saying, please let me break out. I think I can do it. I think I can escape. And Hitler is going, no. You've got to stay there. You've got to stay firm. You've got to fight to the last man and the last bullet. Why is Hitler organising this last stand that's utterly pointless and pitiful? Because it's all about prestige and not about military joined-up thinking. You know, for Hitler, it is better to lose 250,000 men in a kind of hopeless battle than it is for these men to withdraw. You know, this makes no military sense, but in Hitler's twisted thinking, it kind of makes political sense for him. There's a glory in death. There's a glory in an army being destroyed, fighting for the good of the Third Reich.
Paulus is kind of being let down by his supreme commander. There's a lot of criticism Paulus got after the Second World War about he was too timid, he should have taken the initiative and got his army out of there. He kind of did want to, but he was still a man who would follow his mission and follow his orders. And if his own direct commander, which is Manstein, saying to him, we are having these discussions about how we could break out, if we want to break out, I will let you know as soon as I know. I will be discussing it with Hitler at Supreme Headquarters. But Manstein was never going to give him that order.
Finally, on the 12th of December, nearly a month after Paulus and his troops were encircled, Hitler agreed to launch a relief operation. Winter Storm, envisioned by von Manstein and commanded by Hermann Hoth, was intended to smash through the Soviet lines from the south and open the pocket, releasing Paulus's encircled units. But by then it was too late. The winter weather was too severe, Soviet resistance too strong, and Paulus's troops too weak to attempt to break out and meet up with the advancing German columns. With the city in sight, the relief attempt had to be abandoned.
When Hitler does say to von Manstein, yes, you can go in, you can try and punch your way in, it's just far too late. The weather is appalling. The Germans just don't have the equipment or the manpower to break through the Russian encirclement. Now, had this been ordered weeks, months before, things might have gone the right way.
It was an offensive that had too few troops, too little armour, that was arraigned against too many fresh Russian forces. So even though it was successful to a point, I think at one point they get to about 40 kilometres away from Stalingrad, to where the defenders in the highest buildings, where they've got their observation points, could see the flares being shot into the sky by Manstein's relief force. It still wasn't close enough.
Soviet forces that had continued to strengthen their positions surrounding the city now began remorselessly reducing the size of the Stalingrad pocket, forcing the Germans deeper into the ruins. On the 23rd of December, just 2 days before Christmas, the Soviets overran the last remaining German airfield in the city. With all chance of escape now gone, German soldiers were forced to spend a bleak Christmas deep in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad.
By Christmas time, he knows that they're not in a position to break out. They're too weak now, and the enemy's positions around them are too strong, and the winter conditions are making it impossible too. He's now going to go back into the city itself because the perimeter is being really reduced by countless Russian offensives, and that's where the end game's going to happen.
Hitler doesn't think like a normal human being. He just thinks that whatever decisions he makes, because he's a demigod, ultimately, then that's always going to be the right decision. He is infallible. So therefore, it's destiny. If they lose at Stalingrad, that's destiny. That's part of the story of the 1,000-year Reich. You can turn a defeat in propaganda terms, in narrative terms, into a victory by saying, These noble young men gave up their lives for me and the Third Reich. This is surely a noble and great thing. There's nobility in death.
If they were ever going to have a successful breakout, it would have been in those first few weeks of the offensive first beginning. So from the 19th of November through to the end of the month, that was the key time of when he should have taken his chance, if he'd been allowed to break out to the west and save his army.
On Christmas Day, the Soviets began broadcasting a message to the trapped German troops. Every 7 seconds, a German soldier dies in Russia. Stalingrad is a mass grave. The message was accompanied by the sound of a ticking clock. The message and the ticking went on all day.
But you've got to remember that, we're looking here at late December in a very cold place indeed. And the numbers being lost are just appalling. On Christmas Day, 1,024 Germans are killed just that day.
Christmas for the German troops in Stalingrad, it's as you're basically, it's all over and you know it. There's talk of the Luftwaffe coming in, but those days are already gone. You're down to kind of barely 900 calories a day. You're living off dregs, there's hardly any water. If you get wounded, your chances of getting out and recovering are almost zero. This is absolutely Armageddon for Sixth Army. It must have been just truly, truly horrific.
After 4 months trapped in the city, Paulus was under no illusion of the fate being forced on him and his army.
Even though Paulus was under pressure from Hitler and Supreme Headquarters to carry on the fight, as Hitler famously said, the Sixth Army will carry out its historic task, which meant sacrificing itself to save the whole strategy of the Southern Offensive. He still was seeing all around him the casualties that were mounting up every day, not just in terms of the fighting that was going on to defend the Kessel, but in terms of men just dropping down dead from exposure, hunger, hypothermia, everything. He wasn't a fool. Everyone recognised the fact that the army was going to be sacrificed. He's not stupid, he knows this.
Hitler feels no empathy on 2 levels. He doesn't feel any understanding of the situation, the strategic situation. Secondly, he feels no empathy on what anybody would recognise as being on a human level. He doesn't think of the individual man on the ground, frostbitten, terrified, starving, rained on by artillery, being sniped upon. This is an appalling place to be for any human being. And Hitler is shown at one point some of the letters the soldiers are writing home. And these letters paint a very, very bleak story. Some of the letters say, "Don't miss me, I've died, but I don't know what I've died for. I think," some of these letters even say, "I think the Führer's got it wrong." And Hitler looks at these letters and he just kind of shrugs. That is his complete lack of understanding. Hitler feels so little empathy that he doesn't even go to field hospitals to look at the wounded. And he never does any of that. Why? Because that's looking reality in the face. He never wants to look at the horror of what he is inflicted on the world.
On the 25th of January, Soviet troops succeeded in splitting the German forces in 2, a southern and a northern pocket. Paulus and his men were now in a hopeless situation. Zhukov knew this, so he offered the exhausted German troops a lifeline: surrender. In return for his surrender, Zhukov promised Paulus and his men full rations, medical treatment for the ill and wounded, and permission to retain their military insignia and personal effects.
Now, when we look at these terms of surrender, we see that respect for the ordinary soldier that Zhukov is known for amongst his own men.
We're now in January, and Paulus is being offered surrender terms by the Russians. I mean, the Russians have got the humanity and basic common sense to say, look, Paulus, I think you're a bit stuck here, and all your men are going to die. Is it not better for you and for everybody if you just surrender, right? There's no other option, really. Paulus, of course, radios this back to Hitler. We can't break out. Can I please surrender? Hitler just thinks this is insanity. Well, why would you want to surrender? It is far better for you just to fight to the last man. He just thinks of these people as just constituents of a square on a map and nothing else.
The last few days of the Kessel before the surrender, Paulus had moved his headquarters into the city, the heart of the city, where famously he's in the Univermag department store. And he became quite a lost figure, you could say. He's a shell of his former self. He's gaunt. His facial tic that he was famous for having, it was constant. The weight of the pressure had made him almost a hunchback. And he was taking much longer hours now, just staying in his own quarters and lying on his bed.
On the 30th of January, Paulus was informed by radio message that he was promoted to Field Marshal. It carried a chilling implication.
Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal, but as everyone knew, he knew, and Hitler, who was awarding him it, knew, no German Field Marshal had ever been captured alive by the enemy. What he was saying to him was, in very obvious terms, was shoot yourself. Having spent weeks ruminating on the fact that betrayal is a strong term, but I would say let down by his superiors who hadn't listened to his pleas to withdraw the army before they were surrounded, he was in no mood to say, I'm not going to give you the easy way out of then announcing that I've committed suicide. And as he said to many of his subordinates in the HQ staff that saw the radio message from Hitler, I'm not going to play that game. And he was a committed Christian as well. As he said to one of his staff officers, it's against my religion to take my own life. I'm not going to do that.
It really is the end game now. This attrition, this encirclement has gone on for so long. Paulus is in a hopeless situation. Hitler thinks that he can turn a defeat into victory in propaganda terms by invoking this idea that he really genuinely believes, which is there's nobility in death, fighting to the last man, the last bullet, doing that for the Third Reich. And there's this celebrated sort of radio address in which he compares the encircled army to the last men at Thermopylae.
Speaking in place of Hitler, who never delivered bad news, Göring shared with the German people the news of the Sixth Army's impending destruction. For many, this was the first time that they had heard of the disastrous situation. Drawing comparisons to the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, in everything but name, it was a eulogy.
Es waren 300 Männer, meine Kameraden. Und heute gilt dieser Kampf dort, dieses Opfer dort, noch so heroisch, so als Beispiel höchsten Soldatentums. Und es wird auch einmal heißen, kommst du nach Deutschland, so berichte, habest uns in Stalingrad liegen sehen, wie das Gesetz, das heißt, das Gesetz der Sicherheit unseres Volkes es befohlen hat. Das Gesetz für Deutschland zu sterben, wenn das Leben Deutschland diese Forderung an euch stellt.
Imagine being encircled and listening to this and going, okay, so he wants us all to die? That's our leader? And the German public, they're not buying it. There are a lot of private correspondences going on, even some people saying things a bit more publicly, going, this isn't right. this isn't working. This isn't what we signed up for. Yeah, we invaded France without too much difficulty, but why 250,000 of our sons, our fathers, our brothers, why are they just going to die? For what reason? None.
On the morning of the 31st of January, Red Army troops entered the basement where Paulus had based his headquarters. The fighting had ended. The Soviets had won.
Командующий группой немецких войск под Сталинградом генерал-фельдмаршал Паулюс и его начальник штаба генерал-лейтенант Шмидт. В декабре Паулюс отдал приказ пленных не брать без сознания или даже мертвым, что генерал всегда имел при себе 2 револьвера и яд. Как видим, он попал в советские руки вполне здоровым.
Paulus played very little part in speaking to the Russian intermediaries that came on that final day, on the 31st of January, to take the surrender of the Sixth Army. As you can see from the Soviet newsreels, the propaganda films that filmed him coming into the headquarters of the 64th Army. He doesn't know where he is, he's a rabbit in headlights. His physical condition, his mental condition was a metaphor for the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. It was shattered. It was a shell of its former self, and it was ready to march into captivity meekly.
And on February the 2nd, 1943, after 162 days of the heaviest fighting in the history of warfare, the last shot was fired. Peace came to Stalingrad.
Paulus was one of the lucky ones. 400,000 German soldiers died in the battle for Stalingrad. Of the 90,000 German men captured, only 6,000 survived. For the Soviets, casualties were even worse. Over 1 million soldiers and citizens were killed in the fighting. As for the 2 men at the top, the battle for Stalingrad was over, but the war went on.
When the surrender finally happens, Hitler, again, that delusion takes place. Whose fault is it? Now, it's clear to all the top brass around him that it's Hitler's fault. This did not need to happen. Let's go back to Directive 45, which called for Stalingrad to be fought for. They could have gone round Stalingrad, but instead Hitler said, I want to take this really quite big city. He didn't need to. So that was problem number one, but Hitler does not acknowledge that. And the generals around him, none of them actually say to him, listen, this has been an egregious error. They just can't. They know they're either going to be sacked or something worse is going to happen. But what it does is makes Hitler even more distrustful of his generals. He blames them on poor leadership. Failure has very few fathers, and Hitler is certainly not going to be one of them. It's going to be other people. It's never, ever his fault.
Well, Stalingrad, in terms of numbers, Stalingrad is the biggest, bloodiest battle of World War II, arguably in the history of modern warfare. But I think more importantly, especially for the Soviets, it was the turning point for them psychologically.
Now it knows it can be successful. It knows how to fight the Germans, and it knows how to beat the Germans, importantly.
All eyes had been on Stalingrad, not just in the Soviet Union. You could be reading a newspaper in Sydney, Australia, Cape Town, South Africa, Delhi, India, London, New York. Every day, the international press had a story on its front pages of what was happening at Stalingrad.
A Rubicon has definitely been crossed with the fall of Stalingrad at the beginning of February 1943. It really does change everything, and I think it's such a psychological, catastrophic blow to Germans and Germans back home. It's all going horribly wrong, and now we're going to reap what we've sown.
Stalingrad doesn't just have an impact on the men who were lost there. It has a massive impact on Adolf Hitler himself. That defeat becomes a kind of almost a physical turning point for him. Mentally, he becomes far more brooding, far more withdrawn. He makes very few speeches and radio addresses. Gone now is that kind of jubilant, triumphant, energetic figure that you see in the early days of the regime. You know, what we've got now is increasingly a husk of a man. And so he is now a diminished man in many ways. And the more diminished he becomes, the more he refuses to see the world for how it is. Stalingrad, make no mistake, is the beginning of the end for Adolf Hitler.
You see a sort of transition in Stalin. There's a real change, and this is all to emphasize the fact that we are now all at war. It doesn't matter that families are ripped apart. It doesn't matter that millions of people are going to be killed. The point is, they will win. They will defeat the Nazi hordes, and it will be done with utter ruthlessness, both to his own side and to the enemy.
Stalin had shown that he could beat Hitler. But the rivalry between the two tyrants would not end here. With much of Eastern Europe still under Nazi occupation, Stalin's armies now prepared to bring the war to Germany. The consequences for Hitler and the German people would be deadly.